Women are either allowed to be a whore or a martyr.
She said, I would rather be convicted of murder than live out the rest of my life under the cloud of being an unfaithful wife. She was being manipulated by two male figures in her life to tell a very different version of the story, even at the risk of her own life. She was in fact found guilty, and she was sentenced to hang.
A writer's job is to fill in the gaps. He decides how the story ends.
Once the story is told, it probably will no longer belong to you. What happens when someone else retells it? You're listening to the Changemakers Book Club with me, Gunjali. Tan Tuan Eng has said in interviews that his 2023 novel, The House of Doors, is a tribute to storytelling, to how stories are told, how they pass from one person's consciousness to another. The novel itself becomes a beautiful example of that idea in action. Some describe it as a tale of love and murder, but that description hardly captures its depth. The story begins and ends with Leslie Hamlin, who is narrating from South Africa, where she has moved with her husband Robert after years spent in colonial Malaya. Looking back on that earlier life, Leslie slowly unfolds a story of a particular moment in her life when their home in Penang became a crossroads for remarkable people and events. Leslie is at the center of the novel, intelligent, observant, and quietly restless within the constraints of colonial society. Her husband Robert is a British lawyer, principled but somewhat conventional, whose work places him close to one of the most sensational trials of the time, the murder case of Ethel Proudlock, a woman accused of killing a man who has assaulted her. The case becomes a public spectacle and raises difficult questions about justice, gender, and power within the colonial system. At the same time, Leslie forms an unexpected friendship with a man who is living in Penang in exile, Sun Yat-sen, the Chinese revolutionary leader. Through him, Leslie is drawn into a wider world of political struggle and revolutionary hope that exists far beyond the quiet rhythms of colonial life. And then another visitor arrives, the writer Somerset Maugham, or Willie as they call him, traveling with his companion Gerald. When Maugham stays at the Hamlins' house, what begins as a polite social visit gradually becomes something deeper. Leslie begins to tell him stories about the Proudlock case, about Sun Yat-sen, about her own life, friendships, desires, and betrayals. What unfolds is not the sharing of memories, but the moment when lived experience begins to transform into fiction. Tan Tuan Eng writes with extraordinary attention to atmosphere, colonial Penang, which is a central character in the novel. Real historical figures move fluidly through the story, blurring the boundaries between history and imagination. Running quietly but powerfully through the novel are questions about ownership of stories. Who gets to tell the stories? What happens when someone else retells it? What is lost or altered when a person's life becomes material for another's art? I was drawn in by the elegance of the prose and stayed for the emotional undercurrents. The sense that behind every story is another door waiting to be opened. And today, I'm really excited to open some of these doors with my guests. Alka Joshi is the internationally best-selling author of the Jaipur Trilogy, a richly textured series that has captured readers around the world and has been translated into 29 languages. Her debut novel, The Henna Artist, began as a deeply personal love letter to her mother and grew into a love letter to India itself. The book became a New York Times bestseller, resonating with readers for its vivid storytelling, unforgettable characters, and immersive sense of place. It paved the way for 2 acclaimed sequels. And across her work, Alka is known for her lush prose, her cultural detail, and emotionally resonant storytelling. Novels that invite readers not just to observe the place and time, but to live inside it, really. I'm so delighted to welcome her to the podcast today. And my second guest, Chengying, wears many hats. But at heart, she's someone who cares deeply about access to justice and how the social sector can do its work better. As the Deputy CEO of Pro Bono Singapore, she works closely with charities and supporters to strengthen organizations behind the scenes, from governance and impact to fundraising and sustainability, so that they can focus on the people they exist to serve. She's also a familiar voice in the legal and social sector space, often speaking about leadership, justice, and what it really takes to build resilient organizations. In 2023, she was part of NCSS 40 Under 40 program, and in 2025, she received the Social Service Professional Merit Award, recognitions that reflect not just her leadership, but the respect she's earned across the sector. Alka and Chengying, so excited to have you both on this podcast to talk about The House of Doors. Alka, let me start with you first. Your initial thoughts about how the book was for you, any particular characters you liked, what really appealed to you about the story?
I absolutely loved the book, and I read it twice. I read it 3 months ago, and then I just familiarized myself with it again now. I thought that it was really interesting to start from Somerset Maugham's life and perspective. There were so many things about him I didn't know, and I had always read his books, but I had no idea that he was gay. I had no idea that he was traveling through Asia and loved doing that. I had no idea that he had a stepdaughter. So any of those things are really interesting to me. Also, finding out about what Malaysia's like was really interesting. I love the pacing because to me, it embodied what the weather of Malaysia was. And that was very slow. It was purposeful. And the word I think of is languid. It felt languid. It unfolded slowly.
And there's such a sense of place in the book. I think Tan Tuan Eng brings obviously Penang to life in that way. I think it kind of reminded me of the way you bring the Pink City Jaipur to life in your trilogy as well. How did that sort of sit with you, the place being like a character in itself?
I loved it. And whenever I can get a feeling for a place, it makes a lot of sense to me because then I can visualize the whole setting, the people in the setting, and so on. So here's a couple of excerpts that I drew that helped me to understand what the climate was. Okay. So, for example, I felt heavy tropical heat smothering, thick and steamy, and the pungent, salty tang of the mudflats at low tide clogged my nostrils. And Leslie is saying at another time, I was a child of the equator, born under the monsoon skies. I pined for the glowing humidity of Penang, of the stately old sana tree shading the roads, for the greens, turquoise, and grays of the Camellia Sea. Oh my gosh, it just evokes so many memories from tropical places that I have visited. I've actually, funnily enough, never been to the south of India where it's really tropical, but I understand this climate because I've been to the rainforest of South America. Then the other thing that the author is doing that really helped me to get in this languid mood of the story was the unfolding of the days. So they often will tell us exactly what the character is doing from morning all the way to evening. And it involves the following. So this is Willie. At 7:30, he would have a quick breakfast. After a bath and a shave, he changed into a freshly pressed cotton shirt and long trousers. For the next 4 hours, he would write. A 1:45, even if he were deep in a scene, he would screw the cap on his fountain pen, keep his exercise book away in the drawer, head downstairs to the veranda for a martini prepared by number one houseboy. I love that, number one and number two houseboy. Following a light lunch with Gerald and the Hamlins, he would while away the rest of the afternoon on the beach with Gerald. They would read in the shade of the coconut trees and bathe in the sea. Despite his problems, the languorous climate was working its powers on him. So that's another way in which the author helps us feel what the mood of the story is. Now, again, there's a very slow build of Leslie's story. We don't see her all at once. We only see her in tiny, tiny pieces that are revealed to Willie. She doesn't actually start talking to Willie until she feels a little more comfortable with him. And so it was that slow build that really helped me also then get in the mood. We don't even find out about Ethel's story until almost,
More than halfway down the book, yeah. Yeah. No, and I think Chengying and I can certainly vouch for the humid climate and the way that it immediately puts you in that sense of what you feel when you're in Singapore as well. The weather here is very similar to what is described. But Chengying, let me come to you now and get your quick thoughts about the book. And I know Alka talked a little bit about Leslie, but I think I want you to specifically talk about her. And did she feel like feminist and a strong sort of woman who I almost think could have been a social sector leader with the way she was pushing back with the men and what they were saying? But your quick thoughts as well.
I think for me, it took a very long time to understand Leslie, because in the initial, you see the real struggle that she has. She wanted, for example, her reaction towards Somerset, right? At first, she was repulsed by him because of his sexual orientation. And yet later on, she feels drawn to share her deepest secrets with him as well. And I found that she was a very conflicted character in this way. And even her relationship later on with Arthur, I couldn't understand whether she truly wanted to be with Arthur or whether it was kind of a reaction towards her husband's infidelity. And while she was very involved in the revolution, and she took part in the reading club and she helped to proofread papers in English and she participated in the fundraising, did she believe in the cause, or was she just kind of a participant, right, that just happened to be at the right place at the right time? So I found it really hard to understand what she really wanted. And even at the end of the day, when she left to Africa and her husband had passed and she was just willing her days away. When the book came, then that was when she decided that, okay, it's time for me to go back and be reunited with, I don't know who's her love, is it Arthur or is it Penang? So in a sense, yes, there were certain things that she did that were very feminist, but at the same time, it also felt like a mixture of, just chance and seizing the opportunity at the moment. Yeah, so for me, I found it really hard to understand her motivations.
She does behave like she's still trying to figure a lot of who she is out. And it's difficult for her because she is so attached to this place, which is not her place. She's in colonial Malaya. She's a Caucasian woman. She's adapted a lot of the practices and the cultures, but she's still seen as primarily as a white woman. And that's really part of the identity that she has. So I think she's trying to kind of figure herself out along the way as well. So Chengying, I did kind of resonate with some of the things you shared about her not being the most clear person to understand. But Alka, I think in terms of the story and how she actually finally opens up to Willie, there's actually a moment in the novel where Robert warns her not to tell mom too much, because he says once the story is told, it probably will no longer belong to you. Willie's probably going to write about you in some way. And I think as a best-selling author, I wanted to get your thoughts on how things have changed for you around the social relationships you have, right? Are people very around you because you are looking for stories all the time and they think that they're going to appear in like chapter 3 of your new book or something, or they want to come and talk to you? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, I love this question, but I want to answer a little bit of Chengying. At one point, Leslie says women are either allowed to be a whore or a martyr. And I do think that she's trying to find her place within this spectrum, because she knows that she is neither one or the other. And she does not believe that women should be one or the other. So I got the feeling that she's a feminist, but she's also a product of her time. So to answer your question, a writer's job is to fill in the gaps. He decides how the story ends. And then I think that what Willie says also is that people find it, his job is to be a listener and to be a recorder of the events. And I think that he's such a good listener that it's hard not to confess to him. It's hard not to tell him their stories. I am a great listener. I am constantly observing people, constantly looking. I'm always asking questions, probing questions that allow them the opportunity to tell me what they really think about things. And I've done that long before I became an author. As you know, I didn't become an author until my 50s. And until then, I had been drawing and painting, doing advertising and marketing. So I had to listen to other people. I had to be in tune with how I was observing the experience around me. Without observing that experience, I can't do my work, the work that was paying my mortgage. So I don't think that people are wary around me. Sometimes they make a joke after they've told me a really fascinating story. They go, "Oh, now you'll probably put that in your book." And I always say, that's your story. What I'm going to do, taking the essence of their story and I'm filling in details, maybe I'm adding a character who can react to some of those details the way that, a normal person might react. And I always assure them it's not your story I'm writing. I'm writing a story that resonates with me. It may have elements of you in it, but don't worry, you'll never recognize yourself.
Fascinating. I think at the end of it, she was actually a little disappointed that not a lot of her and Robert end up in Willy's story as well. And so there's always that conflict that someone might have. But Chengying, I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about the Ethel Proudluck trial that sits very quietly but in the background. And as we mentioned, comes a little bit later in the story, but becomes pretty front and center. And Leslie and Arthur are having a discussion, and Arthur says that he doesn't think that justice will be done because this is an Angmo on trial and the verdict will be not guilty. And there are so many other very interesting facets about the trial. It's, again, very publicized. People are aware that Ethel is having an affair, and it's really interesting for them to read about this. But how did that sort of sit with you in terms of how justice is portrayed in this case and the exposure of how the law can be applied differently? What were your thoughts around that?
Yeah. Gunjali, this is a really interesting question to answer in 2026 because this is the year we're actually celebrating the bicentennial year of the Second Charter of Justice, which was when court systems were introduced to Singapore, Malacca, and Penang. So we're celebrating 200 years of the rule of law. And what we can see from the book is that in the 1920s, nobody believed that the rule of law would actually be upheld and would be applied fairly, right? And you can tell that people thought that your social status and colonial attitudes would actually influence the outcome of cases. So for example, when Leslie first found out that her friend Ethel had been arrested for murder and she spoke to her husband Robert, who is a lawyer, he said, "Calm down, my dear. It's just a formality. She will just get off with a slap on the wrist. This person is being arrested for murder." And when she eventually got charged with murder, the gallery erupted with shouts and cries because no one thought that would have happened. The scandal in the story was how justice was actually served, And when she was remanded, she was in a European women's wing where their daily activities were sewing and reading. Totally different from what we would have expected based on the description of the facade of the jail and the prison. And even her lover, Arthur, said, "Don't worry, the judge will just put on a show of fairness, of impartiality, but in the end, the verdict will be not guilty." He even told her, "Don't go to KL to support your friend. She doesn't need it because even if they find her guilty, they will never hang her." So when she was in fact found guilty and when she was sentenced to hang, for me, the irony was in how that was the scandal. And that was when there was a public uproar. But of course, the outcome was, as what people would have expected, which is that the Sultan actually pardoned her on the condition that she leaves Penang and takes all her immorality with her. And in the end, it was, maybe public pressure that influenced the outcome of the case. And these are things which, we would not expect to see 200 years on, in Singapore and in Penang as well. Thank goodness the legal systems have also evolved in the past century. The other thing that really struck me about the case, and which is very different from how justice is being served in Singapore and Penang now, would be the gender expectations, So there was one sentence that Leslyn said which really stayed with me. She said, "I would rather be convicted of murder then live out the rest of my life under the cloud of being an unfaithful wife. Someone would rather risk death by hanging than potentially damaging her family's standing. And to me, that was really something that stayed with me after I finished reading the book. That women may have to fit into certain narratives to be seen as respectable victims, to be credible in court, to have your voices heard. And there was a lot of hoo-ha, right, during the trial about how on the day of the alleged rape or alleged murder, depending on how you look at it, she was wearing an alluring dress with a very low neckline. They even got Leslyn in to take the witness stand to say, oh yeah, she wears all these alluring dresses all the time, even when she's alone. So
She's very fashionable. She's a very fashionable friend.
exactly. Yeah, it was a crime to be fashionable then, it seems. So, this is very different from how we would treat sexual assault victims in court now, The courts would focus on the evidence, they would focus on legal standards, and not whether the victim fits a certain moral stereotype. And definitely persons who say that they have been victims of serious offenses, they would probably not have to testify so publicly in an open court as well. So those were the things that really struck me when I was reading the book, through the eyes of a lawyer.
I just realized that what we're reading is really the point of view of the colonists, right? We're not exposed to the point of view, except in very brief terms, when we're talking about Sun Yat-sen, from the point of view of the actual citizens of that area, the indigenous folks. And I realized that when I write my books, I am writing from the point of view of the citizens of the area, the indigenous people, the people who really have a right to be there, who've been there for centuries. And there's a part of me when I read stories like this that actually gets my hackles up, because I look at this leisurely life that these colonial people are leading, and yet it's the people who are the residents of the area, the original residents of the area, who are all their houseboys, their servants, the people taking care of them, taking care of their every need. And there is a part of me that really resents that when I read a story like this. I can enjoy it for the story, but I'm also personally insulted by the ways that the people of the area are treated by the colonizers.
And I think there's a part where Amma, who takes care of Leslie and her children, wants to make enough money to go back to China. I think there are those very interesting sort of pieces of information there that give you an idea about how some of the other folks are leading their lives who are not benefited by this colonial life. But Chengying, I want to double click a little bit more around any sort of comparisons that you were able to make to the work that you do now, especially with, for example, the migrant workers who come to Singapore, and how Pro Bono SG, where you work, is looking to make sure that even though they are not the residents of Singapore, and perhaps the laws don't keep them in mind in some way, we really need to make sure that they have access to justice in the way that everybody should. You want to talk a little bit about that?
At Pro Bono SG, a big part of the work that we do is to plug the gaps. So government legal aid covers the lower income Singaporeans and permanent residents very well, but we also do see gaps in terms of the migrant worker population and for transnational families that are not eligible for government legal aid, and that is where we step in to help them. Another part of Pro Bono SG's work that is very interesting is how we are actually supporting communities that don't appear to be vulnerable, but actually have vulnerabilities. For example, when you look at Ethel, right, in the story, everyone thought that she would never be sentenced to death because, number one, she's a Caucasian woman and she has a lawyer. Her husband actually managed to hire her, I think, one of the most expensive lawyers in town. But then, towards the end of the book, we realized that she was being manipulated, right, by two male figures in her life to tell a very different version of the story, even at the risk of her own life. And actually, that is what we at Pro Bono SG also see. For example, for the expatriate community, we do have a center that we run together with the Paris Bar Association to support French women victims of violence in Singapore. And while the numbers are small, we do see such expatriate wives coming to our legal clinics to seek help in terms of domestic violence. And you would have expected that, hey, expatriate wives, they don't have financial needs and so on. Why are they at our clinics? But the reality is that being a trailing wife without employment in Singapore and living at the mercy of your husband's dependence pass or immigration wise actually does put you at risk. So I think for me, Ethel's trial also reminded me of how we are serving people that don't appear to be vulnerable, but of course there's always more than meets the eye. And the other thing that really spoke to me was also, in the depiction of the multicultural population in Penang, I really felt like I could have been in colonial Singapore, when Leslyn was describing how she was going to Armenian Street, her rickshaw puller, Alek, drops her off outside the Goddess of Mercy temple. There's the smell of the incense. Rickshaw players congregate there to play chess outside of the temple. You turn a corner and then it's a mosque. You turn another corner and then you're suddenly at Armenian Street with all these beautiful shop houses. In Singapore, we also have an Armenian Street. We also have this street of what we call the Street of Harmony, where there's a temple, followed by a Hindu temple, followed by a mosque, all within walking distance. And it really reminds me of the role of, places of worship and community spaces in congregating the community. Because when all these migrant workers came to Singapore, having all these enclaves, really made it important for them to also find, I guess, a sense of belonging. And even in Singapore today, we still see some of that, right? We still have our Chinatown, we still have our Little India and so on. And how it's relevant to Pro Bono SG is that, that's where we do our outreach. When we want to reach out to migrant workers, we go to Little India. We set up a migrant workers law center in the heart of Little India because many of the migrant workers frequent there, especially over the weekend. And when we want to reach out to the elderly who don't speak English, then we have our community law center, which is hosted in a Taoist temple, Tianta Temple in Alka, where there's a huge elderly population. So it kind of reminds me that, people, the value of community spaces and the role they play in social services, 200 years on.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. That's super insightful. Just celebrating our diversity also is such an interesting aspect of Singapore, and there were glimpses of it in the book as well. Alka, I am really interested to ask you about the aspect of like the author really not wanting to write another story, another book, but getting into the financial doldrums that he did. You mentioned earlier that you only started writing in your 50s. You'd had a career and had some sort of base to build on. But talk a little bit about that. Writing is not that easy. You can't just like pull a new story out of nowhere. But then when there's like this financial context to it, how does that work?
I think that by the time I started writing, I was financially pretty well set. I had been working for 30 years in the fields of marketing and advertising, and 20 of those with my own advertising agency. I don't feel pressure to write because of the money. I feel that I'm much more motivated by wanting to tell stories about the people of my culture. And I want to tell the historical fiction stories pre-independence and post-independence. It's very important for me to communicate how hard it is for a country to rebuild itself after 300 years of colonization. And so that is what I write about. I write about the resilience of the Indian people, especially the women, because let's face it, women are the backbone of our society. And I also write about how history influences the economic situation that people find themselves in pre-independence and post-independence. So for me, I think writing is more of a personal journey. It started out as a love letter to my mother because I wanted to create this character of Lakshmi in the henna artist who looked just like my mother, but got to make all the choices that she, as a traditionally raised Indian woman, did not get to make. And so I wanted to thank her for raising me so differently, for raising me as such an independent girl. She just always allowed me to do whatever I wanted to do and encouraged me to make my own decisions about my future. I used the henna artist as a way to immortalize her and to thank her and to give her this alternate life that I imagined for her if she had had more independence. Then that research into India in 1955, immediately after independence in 1947, led me to really think about India and India's people and how they were affected by so many years of so many people invading them. That led me to all these other stories, including this latest one, 6 Days in Bombay, about Amrita Sher Gill, who is really one of India's national treasures. She was an amazing woman in the 1930s, Indian, half Hungarian, part Jewish, and she really lived life to the fullest. She also created works of art that I think deserve the world's attention, and I don't want people to forget about her. And this is another thing that I really appreciated about of Doors. Somerset Maugham talks about how he says, we will be remembered through our stories. A story can carry a name beyond the clouds, beyond even time itself. And Leslie begins to understand. And she says, all those people you put in your stories, the world might know Sadie Thompson, one of his characters, as a whore. But because of you, Willie, she will not be forgotten. She will live forever. And that's what I am trying to do. And I think being successful is to try to highlight stories of women during uncomfortable times, during really trying times, and knowing that they did their best to uplift people, to help other people, to gain agency of some kind for themselves. I don't want them to be forgotten.
Both of you are so true to being the change makers that you are. Alka, you with your storytelling, and Chengying, you with the work you do with Pro Bono SG. I'm just so grateful that we've got to hear facets of yourselves and the work that you do through this podcast, and also a little bit through the lens of the book. So I think as we wrap up, I just wanted to get your last thoughts on the book. Would you recommend it? Because this is a book club conversation. So we do need to give it some sort of rating, and sort of anything else that you want to add about your experience reading it. Chengying, you want to go first?
Sure. I think for me, I'm fascinated by the symbolism with the doors. I mean, the book is called The House of Doors. Reading it the second time, it made me think about what the doors actually mean, because so many characters in the novel, they keep secrets and secrets that are only slowly revealed to you as the door opens and as you turn the page. And as they make various decisions, right, in their life. So I think the imagery of the doors really stay with me through the book. I would recommend people to persevere through chapter 1, because for me, I found it to be a bit of a slow build-up. I'm an impatient person, and I was like, okay, I got to hang on for Gunjali. But once I think I got to, when the scene shifted from chapter 1 in South Africa to Malaya, and then I slowly got drawn into this very familiar tropical landscape, then I was hooked. So stay on, persevere.
Yeah, Alka?
I would definitely recommend the story as an exercise in how to reveal something very slowly, methodically, and with the ultimate resolution that makes you go, oh my God. Because not only do we learn about Robert and his secrets, we learn about Leslie and her secrets, then we learn about Ethel and her secrets. Oh my gosh, it was so amazingly displayed, revealed, and I love that slow build and the final reveals.
Well, thank you for humoring me and reading the book, as well as coming on the podcast today. I'm so delighted that we finally made this happen, and I'm so grateful to both of you. I really enjoy books that are set in Asia, and you might have heard my episode on 7 Moons of Mali Almeida, a delightful murder mystery set in Sri Lanka that I covered last year. A couple of books to recommend that have been written by Singaporean authors. The first one Alka mentioned earlier, Bali Jaswal's Now You See Us, another murder mystery set in Singapore that follows 3 women who set to find out what's really behind the news of the murder of an employer where the maid stands accused. I also finished reading The Original Daughter by Jemima Way recently, a tale of 2 sisters, their bond, and the many challenges that threaten to tear them apart. Do give them a read. This is Gunjali, and thank you so much for listening.